By my clock, I've got noon straight up Eastern time. So welcome everyone. My name is John Marx. I am the Executive Director of the Law Enforcement Survival Institute. I am the editor of TREPP.com and the author of the book, Armor Yourself, How to Survive a Career in Law Enforcement. I am joined today by my co-host, Chaplain Carrie Friedman. Carrie is an Associate Director of the Law Enforcement Survival Institute. Some of you may know him for his work with the FBI National Academy and designing their program entitled Tools for Intentional Spirituality. Carrie is the author of a number of books, but specifically for law enforcement, he's the author of the book Spiritual Survival for Law Enforcement and also the book Wisdom from the Bat Cave. So thank you for joining me today, Carrie. Oh yeah, that part, that's me. And that's Carrie. And more importantly, what we'd like to talk about today is this question that we pose to all of you and a lot of people out there in the world. What would you have liked to have known before you started on the job? And then we've rephrased that a couple of times. What would you like to be teaching the next generation of cops based on what you've experienced in your career, or what would you share with a rookie cop, one thing that would save them a lot of frustration? And another way to put that, if you could go back in time, what would you advise yourself about the career ahead of you, knowing what you know now? And we've gotten some really interesting responses, but we would like to engage those of you that have joined us today. So let me just talk a little bit about what we plan to do today. We are going to run this like a webinar, in that we will probably be doing a lot of the talking just to fill some of that time, but we would like to engage you. So although it'll be a webinar, we would also like to run it like a web meeting and have each of you have an opportunity to speak if you choose. I can hear some background noise. One thing I will tell you is there is a button at the lower left of your screen, at least that's where it is on mine, that allows you to mute your microphone. So if you are not speaking, if you would mute your microphone, that'll avoid any kind of background noise we're picking up. Also, I see several of you, you have the option of joining us on video if you choose. You don't need to do that. And I think the proper protocol would be, if you choose to speak, would you just introduce yourself briefly? Just tell us your name and where you're from, so we know, who's in our audience. But maybe I'll get started just to get the ball rolling. We got some interesting responses to this. Actually, Carrie, why don't I throw it over to you? I've got some responses. I think you do too, but you haven't said a word yet. So why don't I throw it over to you for a minute, and let's talk about this question.
Okay, well, it's great to be here, and thank you to all of you who are joining us. I got some responses too from, I posted it on various social media outlets, and I posed the question, what would you want to tell a younger version of yourself? If you could go back in time and teach yourself something, if you could teach a rookie cop, we formulated it in a whole bunch of different ways, and I got two different kinds of responses. They both made me laugh a little bit. The one category, one kind, was with really great perspective, very philosophical. People talked about, if I could do it all over, if I could talk to my younger self, I would just remind him or her about the things that are important in life, and to kind of keep a perspective of what really matters and what doesn't matter. So often people spend so much of their lives, their resources, their mental resources, their time, energy, efforts, thoughts, they're like just churning, they're thrashing around with all kinds of things that really never turn out to be in the end, and then they find out that they've wasted a pretty good part of their life. So that was one kind of response that I got. The other kind of response that I got were answers that were tinged with tremendous bitterness. They were talking, I don't know, John, if you, I see you nodding, I don't know if you experienced that kind of thing. A few people picked things up that were just, I would say, don't do this, or and like they were tinged with such anger and like I said, bitterness. Tell me, what you had the same experience?
Yeah, in fact, obviously we kind of baited the hook with information that is what we talk about. But interestingly enough, I did find about probably more than 75% of the responses I got were that angst, that anger, that frustration, sadness about the career. And some of it then was advice for young cops or any, by the way, we're not focused solely on sworn law enforcement here. It could be anybody in this profession, in my opinion. It can be in civilian employees, dispatchers, crime scene techs, anybody that's involved in this profession on a broad basis. We're all impacted by this. And so we were kind of curious what people said. And I'd be happy to read some of them, but, go ahead.
Well, I found that the responses that I got were probably about 50-50. They were running 50-50. Like I said, the first category were people who were more philosophical, and they were, in other words, their time in the career and in life had taught them certain things that they were a little grounded. They had some perspective now. And the other kind were just, like you said, with the angst, the anger, the anguish, the bitterness, and cops are notorious for being pretty funny. And just like the sarcasm, the particular formulation of them, I was actually laughing even as my heart was breaking, because all of those statements reflected a lot of heartache. But I happen to be somewhat one-dimensional. John is the author you mentioned before of Armor Yourself, and at the Law Enforcement Survival Institute, he's always creating this framework. He believes, and correct me if I'm wrong, I hope I'm going to do justice to what you believe, but there are different aspects of a human being. There's the physical, the mental, the emotional, the spiritual, and John, in Armor Yourself, creates a framework for addressing each of those in turn. Obviously, those dimensions aren't broken down into separate dimensions that there's no overlap. Obviously there is overlap, but just for the simplistic, to simplify the process, to be able to strengthen, to address each aspect of a person. So at Lessie, and in the book Armor Yourself, John has separated out those various quadrants, those aspects of a person. All of my work is focused, just squarely on the spiritual dimension. And I spend a lot of my time trying to define what spiritual means, to distinguish it from religious, to distinguish it from mental and emotional and psychological, because by spiritual, I mean something very, very different. It's the way that the human spirit gives expression, the way a person gives expression and puts into practice his or her noblest ideals, values, aspirations, desire, more than a desire, a need to accomplish, to do something in this world, to live a life of meaning, to leave a legacy of good for those who will follow. So I'm always focused right squarely in that quadrant of the spiritual. And what I saw, and I'm biased because I tend to interpret everything in my perspective, but both the answers that were more philosophical and the answers that were more bitter, both those, what I heard they were tinged, where they were coming from was from that quadrant of the spiritual. They had I think a lot of people felt very betrayed. I think they entered the career with certain aspirations, certain spiritual aspirations, and when they were frustrated and they weren't able to realize those aspirations, those spiritual aspirations, I think what remains is a lot of bitterness. So what I'm going to do in the course of this conversation, every time we're discussing anything and it's my turn, I'm going to frame things, I'm going to interpret them through the perspective, through the prism of spirituality. I'm going to see the things that deplete and the things that replenish, the challenges, the accomplishments, everything, every aspect of this career, I believe is spiritual. So I'm going to keep talking about and keep forcing us back to that quadrant. So I think those were the kinds of answers that I saw, spiritual answers.
Well, and giving you your due, if I had the expertise you have, I wouldn't have to be a generalist, but that is what I am, because I am not a chaplain, and I'm somebody who survived a career. I served for 23. I've been a law enforcement trainer now for over 38. So, I have my perspective, and I'm so thankful that we have you giving us guidance. But let me prime the pump a little bit. Let me read a couple of the ones that I got. And then I would like to ask anybody who wants to share to do that as well. And then we'll talk about it a little bit. And you know, my opinion is that the real question here is not so much what advice we would give. I think that's really valuable. And I would like to take this further because I would love to get more of these and collect them, whether we put it up on Cops Alive or I don't know what we'd do with it. But I think the advice for people coming into the career is invaluable, and I appreciate all of you sharing your thoughts with us. But the other question, and I think Carrie's kind of alluded to that, is, well, what do we do about it? Because some people absolutely are suffering, and I don't think that we should suffer. You know, in my little bit later, I'll talk a little bit about it. I think this is the most noble profession on earth. And I think anyone, civilian or sworn, that goes into this profession is making sacrifices. And, you know, I always joke, we deserve to get to Ali Ali Oxenfree and live happily ever after. And my goal is to help people find that path. And I think some of these quotes are telling you that people have lost their way a little bit. So let me stop talking about that and read a little bit. One of them said, I would explain to them that you cannot worry about what happens to your cases as they progress through the court system. Do the right thing on the street and let the attorneys do what they will do afterwards. If you get upset every time a case is dropped or a weak sentence is given out, you will be upset a lot. And that's absolutely rings true for me. Another one, don't give up on your physical fitness. That, you know, I think our profession has been chastised a little bit about, you know, dealing with challenges of obesity. And we know that physical fitness is one of the ways we can keep ourselves healthy throughout our career and into retirement. And yet so many people, the physical fitness is a symptom of other things that are happening. One more here. You have to learn how to control your anger or it will eat you up. And I think that's kind of what we're alluding to here. So that's priming the pump a little bit. Do you have something you want to add? And then we'll invite others to share.
I was just struck, a number of people private messaged me. I put things on.
I'm not hearing you very well all of a sudden. Keep talking.
I was just saying that, can you hear me now? Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. I was just saying that a number of people private messaged me. Both I had posted it on Facebook and on LinkedIn. And I had a whole bunch of people who wrote to me and said, I would tell my younger self, or I would tell my kid, just don't do it. Just don't do it. You're going to be betrayed. You're going to be disappointed. I'm paraphrasing these. That's a much wimpier word. It was, the formulations were much stronger. They were saying, like, you know, just don't do it. You're going to feel betrayed. That word came up a couple of times. You know, that's sad because what you're saying, I agree with 1,000%. It's the noblest profession. People go into the career, I believe, to give expression, to allow them to implement, to act on their noblest instincts, their desire to do good in the world, and to think that they can be in the career and they can stagger out of it at the end, where they feel disillusioned and they feel that they've been betrayed. That's heartbreaking. Heartbreaking. I mean, I would hope, and they deserve, I would think, you know, they deserve more. If they're going to sacrifice themselves, cops are prepared every day. They go on duty to give their lives, but more than that, to live their lives. It's one thing to give one's life is a quick, you know, self-sacrifice in a blaze of glory in an instant, but to live one's life day in and day out, shift in and shift out, to represent the noblest ideals of this profession, of our constitutional system of government, our American way, all those things. People are busy, you know, acting on those kinds of things. To think that at the end of it, they see themselves as having been betrayed and they're disillusioned and they think it was for nothing, it was a waste. That's heartbreaking, and they deserve more. And I think we can give them better to help them.
Yeah. So why don't we open it up? If you're out there and you've got something to contribute, please, we would love to hear from you. That was the whole point of doing this as a web meeting instead of just a pure didactic webinar. So Bill, I saw you bring up your camera.
In for a penny, in for a pound. I didn't realize it's going to be video. I was playing Nanuka the North and just got in from the outside. So I just wanted to advise you, at least one other individual has not been let in yet. One of my former colleagues had just texted me and said he's still waiting to be allowed in. So I don't
Thank
know
you.
if there are any other ones.
Thank you. That's the only one I saw, so thank you.
Okay.
I need to be more attentive. I'm not so sharp on this technology, but my
Well,
apologies.
That's all right. The other bill that's coming on
Yeah.
is firmly ensconced in the 20th century, and oftentimes I think it's the early 20th century.
Well, to the other William or Bill, my apologies. That was my fault, and I think you're there now. So Bill, while you're speaking, did you want to contribute some input on this question?
Yes, I would like to. Without going into the total story, as a background, I spent almost 30 years in the FBI. I was a police instructor. I worked a variety of cases, and I worked closely with other federal and, of course, state and local law enforcement officers, and had become very close to them. Plus, I came from a law enforcement family. But one of the things that we really noticed, you talk about the bitterness. I've noticed a lot of bitterness in people during and then post-career. And that has resulted, I think, almost directly attributable to some of the divorces that I had seen among colleagues in law enforcement, and unfortunately suicides as recently as the last several months.
Yeah.
And it was based kind of on that. I was contacted, I'm in Northwest Ohio, and I was contacted by somebody in the community that wanted to do something for law enforcement people. And one of the best things I found would be able to address the issues you're talking about. And then I started reading things by you, by Carrie, and some of your other fellow former law enforcement people who are addressing, as Carrie characterized, the spiritual side of law enforcement, and been trying to address that. And Carrie has been fantastic and very responsive. And we have been in contact with regularity, and this is the first time we had to really talk. But that is one of the things that I noticed is one thing is being able to have balance. And I've noticed, and I noticed it within myself, it's difficult sometimes to balance family and law enforcement. And even to the point one time on a project that we had with some undercover agents and informants that were doing consensual recordings, I brought them home. I sat down in the family room with my earphones on, and after a couple of hours, my wife came over and took them off. And said, Derek, you have a family here. And at the time, our kids were very little. So perspective and balance is very important.
Thank you for sharing that. Absolutely, that is such good advice.
Excellent, thank you.
William, you came in late. I apologize for that. Did you want to join in? We're just sort of tossing around the questions that we posed on social media to get this webinar started, and that is, you know, phrased in however many ways you want to phrase it. What would you tell yourself if you could take a time machine and go back to the beginning of your career? What advice would you give? What advice would you give to a rookie just starting out? What do you know now that you didn't know then? If you want to share anything, please let us know. Anybody else, please speak up too. All you have to do is go down to the lower left corner of your screen and unmute your microphone, and please join us.
I'll just mention an experience that I had about 2 weeks ago that I hope will motivate some of this discussion. I was teaching a police department, and I had 2 days with them. So I start giving my spiel, and I'm talking about all kinds of things, and I'm trying to give them tools for intentional spirituality. That's the way the behavioral science unit of the FBI, that's what they called the material. What they were looking for, the elusive goal, this was a number of years ago, but they were looking to identify tools for intentional spirituality. They wanted to identify these tools so that law enforcement officers could use them to strengthen themselves. They could nourish themselves. The BSU had been working on this for a long time and identified that if we spend our time addressing and strengthening the physical, the mental, the emotional aspects of a person, for all of that, they still can emerge pretty damaged, pretty broken from the career. So the BSU realized, and they realized that one of the most important, I think it's the most important aspect of a person, of a law enforcement officer, is the spiritual. So I worked with them for a number of years to identify these tools for intentional spirituality. And that's what, in my training nowadays, that's what I do. I share with my students tools for being intentionally spiritual, to replenish their spiritual reserves. I break down the spirituality into 3 dimensions in terms of connecting with some source of absolute ethics that are external to and higher than oneself. Number 2 is having regard for people. And number 3 is having confidence in self. Those are the 3 dimensions, I believe, of being a spiritual person. So I'm teaching these officers in the police department, and the police department was the youngest department I'd ever seen in my life. They had all started anew. They had started on the job. Nobody there had more than 3 years on the job. The chief and the training sergeant, they had been on the job, a lot longer, but all the officers, there were close to 50, none of them had more than 3 years on the job. So as I'm going through my program, I'm teaching them to do this and to do this, to do this. So they're looking at me, they're smiling, they're shaking their heads, they're rolling their eyes. And a few times they start to say to me, we don't have any of these problems. We're not having any of these problems. I'm looking around this room, they're all tall, handsome, strong, physically fit. I don't think anybody of the officers was married yet, and they're still in that honeymoon period where they're having a great time in the job, running around from call to call, getting together at night, they're sharing a beer, they're trading stories, they're having a great time. And a number of them said to me, we're never going to get to that place that you're describing. We're never going to walk that path. We're going to remain in this never land, Peter Pan-like existence where we're young and strong. That's really what they believed, and that's what they were sharing. And I said to them, I wish sort of maybe that was true, but I don't think it is. And it's interesting that I find it much more satisfying. When I left after those couple of days of training, I realized that sometimes it's more satisfying to teach old, bitter cops, because I'll be talking to them and they'll start to cry and they'll say, wait a second, what you're describing me. I've had this happen a number of times. One guy in particular, I was giving a program and he said to me, I feel like you're reading my soul, like you're looking right through me. And people who have been through it on the other end of that trajectory, they get it. And the frustration that I had, the sadness that I felt was I was leaving that day, after those couple of days, realizing that it was hard for me to communicate. I said to them, just hold on to these ideas. You might have to use them down the line. You might not always be feeling the way you are right now, or like everything is just fabulous and you love the job and it's not sapping you or draining you in any way. Hold on to these ideas. So that was, part of the inspiration for the question that we created for today. What would you tell a younger you? These officers, they seem to be just impervious. There was nothing I could say to communicate to them now. So let me pose that as a question. Do you think there is that inevitability? Do people escape these processes, or does anybody escape? Or is there a certain kind of inevitability, an inexorable, grim inevitability that people are going to end up on that other side?
Well, let me take the lead and answer that, and anybody else that wants to jump in can do that as well. I tell my students that I think resilience is like living in a glass house. It is fragile. It is not, in my opinion, not something you're born with per se. I think it is something, just as with your tools for intentional spirituality, that in my definition of what I call tactical resilience, it's about building intentional resilience. I think we all have resilience to a certain degree, but I think particularly in a profession as taxing as ours, I think that we have to continually work at that. And it's also something I don't think you throw stones at either. I don't think you judge someone else. You don't judge your resilience based on someone else. And I think self-awareness is a huge part of this. And I'm thrilled that those young officers are so eager and so enthusiastic. We need that. But yeah, I would say, in my opinion, that some of them, based on that exuberance, may be in for a greater pain than they're expecting. And that I wish that on no one. But that may be the path that so many of my peers and many of my peers and friends have retired as I have. But, you know, I don't think anyone comes out of this career unscathed. Some of us may come out better for it, and I wish that on everyone. But I think many people suffer, and unfortunately that suffering leads to their retirement or their early retirement or even dismissal, and that's what I think we have to work to avoid.
Right.
Bill, you're still...
Okay. Did somebody else pop in there?
Nope, just you, go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to mention something, how the negative aspects can manifest themselves. Doesn't always have to be in the worst case scenario that is initially obvious. And I, for one, can probably attribute a part of I've had serious issues with atrial fibrillation. And I've just been recently told that a good chunk of it could have been due to stress. And I know I have other colleagues, and I shouldn't talk out of school, but Bill Raccia, who hasn't said anything yet, had serious heart problems, and he was also not just on the street, but he was in administration as well. And my point is, the stress can manifest itself in a lot of ways, not just depression, not just bitterness, but you can sublimate it so much, it seems like it manifests itself in its own ugly ways, different ways.
Yeah. I frequently talk about how toxic this career can be, and I think it does erode from the inside out. And, you know, I'm still sort of waiting to see what happens to me, and it's a constant struggle to maintain physical fitness and maintain positive mental outlook. And even though I've been retired for a number of years, I have not shaken off a lot of the training that I received. I still sit with my back to the wall and watch the door, and you know, I'm constantly on it. My head's on a swivel, as my loved ones continually point out to me. So, you know, I think some of that, it takes a long time to manifest, and some of it is much slower than others. I just think that for most people, I think we can prevent some of it. And I think that's what we need to be doing. Carrie, you started to say something there a minute ago.
No, that's fine. I think I would love to hear from some of our other participants. If you don't mind, please weigh in. What I found is that anybody who's done this work for any length of time, they have a lot of wisdom to share. And we would love to hear it.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. It's Sean Peterson from Taunton, Massachusetts.
Hi, Sean.
One of the things I wish kind of was a little more covered when I was in the academy, or I would like to have told myself or addressed, was really the social design of the department itself, and just how divisive it can be at times. And it's almost like an exhausting chess game an officer has to play all the time between unions and the brass and the conflicts that go on and betrayal that happens at times. I wish that was something that was kind of a little more laid out in detail for me as I got into this career.
Thank you for sharing it. You know, again, a lot of what we believe, those of us that are collectively together as the Law Enforcement Survival Institute, is that, you know, we use the term resilience for a lot of things, but I think it is the best descriptive term for how we can endure the career and come out on the other side healthy. And we believe, and that's why there are a whole variety of instructors as part of our cadre, but we believe that resilience is kind of a symbiotic relationship. I don't believe that a healthy officer can thrive in an unhealthy agency or agent, or what have you. And I also don't think that a healthy agency can thrive in an unhealthy community. I wonder about Ferguson, Missouri, even today. I wonder how that has changed and how it has grown. I wonder if it has become a healthier place where the police and the community are cooperating, or whether they're not. I was a community policing coordinator for a long time, and obviously believe in those kind of initiatives. But I think that, cops thrive better in a community that supports them. And that takes an awful lot of work. I acknowledge that it doesn't happen everywhere, but it takes a lot of work, and it takes everybody's initiative down on the street level to try to build cooperation. And so I agree with you completely. One of the things we have to do as we try to build our own resilience is we have to surround ourselves with agency support systems that support that, or we're not going to be healthy.
Sean, I think your point is so fascinating for so many reasons, and I'll tell you, I'll try to identify and share some of them. What I do in my training is, as I mentioned before, I try to lead my students through a process where they begin to realize that every aspect of the career is spiritual in nature. So one of the things that we talk about, I mentioned before, the 3 different accounts of spirituality, that commitment to some higher ethical value and absolute ethic. And then account number 2, dimension number 2 of spirituality is regard for people. Number 3 is confidence in self. And my contention is that officers enter the career, young people enter the career, cadets, with these accounts, they're just brimming over. They're very, very spiritual. And I talk about the fact that everything they do in the course of even the most uneventful of shifts drains those accounts. So I will say to my students, I'll say to them, tell me, what kinds of things do you encounter in the course of your, a typical shift? What kind of things? So people will start giving me examples. They'll say when, a suspect, someone that they're arresting or they're interacting with is being abusive, and they have to remain, restrained in their interaction and respectful. They'll talk about interacting, like observing, being the first responder at a scene, a death of children, of innocent people, the kind of violence and all the things that they encounter on the streets. I've been training for the last 15 years, and I have literally never, and I say this without any exaggeration, it has never once happened that I have given a program where this didn't occur. We're going through, we have dozens, people start shouting out a death of a partner, when like all the different things that drain them, and I say to them, which account is being drained when that happens? When they talk about the fact that the criminal justice system fails people, and before the ink is dry, as they will say, the suspect, the bad guys are already back out on the streets. So I'll say, well, which accounts are being drained? And they keep talking. They'll say, well, account number 1, account number 2, account number 3, whatever they happen to be, whatever they're describing. Every single time I've ever given training, someone will yell out, I can deal with all the garbage out on the streets. It's what goes on in my department. That's what really eats me up. And I've just been struck by that, because and then when the person says that, everyone starts murmuring, start going, yeah, that's true, it's true. I can deal with all that stuff out there, but what goes on inside the department, that is particularly devastating. It eats me up alive. And I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Dr. Kevin Gilmartin, but in the book Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement, in his training, so he has a particular thesis, a reason why he believes what you're describing, like the kind of politics and the things that go on in the department itself and within the agency, why that's so consuming, why it's so galling, why it's so like such an outrage that happens. In the model that I've developed, I have a different reason for it. But I certainly agree with what you're describing, and you're not alone in thinking that. People, I've been all over the country, and every single time, without fail, without exception, people will say to me, whatever's going on out there, it's taxing to a certain degree. But what goes on within the department, as you're saying, between the admin and the union and between like all the kind of politics, that's particularly outrageous. So what you're doing is you're echoing the sentiments of just about everybody who's a cop out there across the country.
I agree. Thank you. Has there been any headway on what the origins of that are, or what the why it is that way? I think that's a huge struggle for myself, is trying to understand. We're told about this brotherhood, and which does exist, but there's also this constant kind of hostility and negativity that goes on within the department, that there doesn't really seem to be much of an explanation for it, or I don't know if it's just a constant vying for power back and forth, and having to be reminded of that, or what it is. But I think that's one of the most frustrating things that's there, is not really understanding it, and especially as a patrolman, kind of feeling left on an island at times.
That's a very powerful image. Go ahead.
I'm not a psychologist. Maybe next time we'll get Dr. Digliani or Dr. Potterat on here. I would speculate. I think it has something to do with sort of that same thing about why we're always harsher on the people we love than others. I think, when we have all the stress of what could happen to us on the street, and I don't really think it matters what job you're in, we have stress. There's tension in this profession. And somehow I think maybe the inside of the walls of our agencies are where we feel a little bit less threatened, and we're more likely to lash out at the people that we should be caring about. I agree with you. I wish there was an easy fix. In a lot of my writing and teaching, I talk about the kinds of support systems that I think we ought to be building. I'll mention one right now because it's one that I still find very rarely, and that's mentoring. We do a lot of training. We do all kinds of assessments when we bring people into the career, and they should be squared away. And then we do some initial training in the academies and, whatever training you receive for your job. And then that training seems to dwindle and decrease throughout the rest of our career to what is considered the bare minimum, usually based on what's legally required. And we don't have a way to sustain people. We don't have a way to build excellence, and we don't have a way to nurture that. My particular agency, we rotated positions quite a bit. Detectives, for the most part, were rotational positions. Most non-patrol positions rotated in and out until they finally realized we had to keep some people with some sort of legacy knowledge in the job, and then we created core positions. But that belief that everybody gets a shot and we have to rotate to build expertise may be hurting us. So I think it's a challenge, and to me, one of the solutions is a mentoring program. Sean, let me throw back to you for a second. Are you still serving, or have you retired?
No, I'm very much still serving. I only have about 5 years on the job, so I'm still a new patrolman. But I had the benefit, I guess, of getting into the career a little bit later in my life. So I was in the academy in my late 20s, and I had done a multitude of. I'm a business owner. I own a small fitness facility. So I don't know if having some other life experience prior to getting into the career played a role in it, which has allowed me to kind of stand back and compare my life experience to the role in the world of law enforcement, to maybe ask a few more questions. But as it compares to some of the other institutions, I guess, that I've worked in, it's definitely an odd world to be in, and how it operates. It's confusing at times, and it's like kind of constantly, shoveling against the tide. We see things that, that famous saying that, that which is measured is improved. There's so many things within law enforcement that we can measure and are immediately addressed, whether it be officers not getting the reports in time, or things that hold us accountable all the time. But when it comes to things that are clearly documented and measured in black and white statistics, like our suicide rates and divorce and everything of that nature, we're not nearly putting in the same effort into those things being improved. They're outlined for us and where our errors and issues lie, but there's not nearly any effort directed towards correcting those things. They're kind of just like, it's a problem, but we're just going to keep going, and we're going to devote our energy towards this thing that most patrolmen kind of, I think they ask the same questions. It's just left kind of not understanding why they're doing what they're doing.
Well, you remind me, and I'm going to plant this seed so I don't forget it at the end, but one of the purposes for having this discussion, no matter how many of you are there watching live or how many of you are going to watch this on YouTube, is, we can discuss this all day long, but what we're going to challenge you to do is to go back and raise these same questions with the people around you. And even for those of us that are retired, it's not that I don't still have coffee with the gang. And, I think all of us still have influence, doesn't matter where we are in the career. And the influence comes from asking questions and getting people to actually think about these things, because we're never going to get to a point of having any action if we don't plant some seeds and start fertilizing them a little bit and going forward. So just in case I forget to say this again later, Sean, I'm going to ask you to, take these questions and take your life experience and start raising these questions with your peers and the people at your agency. I think that's how we get better.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. As a relative kind of response that's happened in the last, I'd say 24 hours to me is, I had kind of just authored an article that asked some questions that basically said, in my opinion, what I believe to be the biggest threat to law enforcement in 2019. And it kind of ruffled a lot of feathers and the brass at the department. I got a tremendous amount of feedback from, I had officers from Argentina send me emails. I had a director from the academy reach out to me. But in posing those questions, it kind of puts me in a unique standpoint where I wonder, I wonder what the perception is. If it's, because there's still that kind of mentality of you kind of keep your mouth shut, kid, and do your job. So it's kind of a unique position to be in. But overall, it's been a lot of great feedback.
Good. Well, I read your article. It was outstanding. And I would say just, keep doing the dance. You don't want to get squashed, so you've got to be careful. But your article was excellent, and I was going to encourage people, we can continue this discussion even offline. We can continue it on social media. People can comment on your article. People can, when we posted the invitation for this webinar on Cops Alive, I believe there's a way to comment on there. You can comment on Carrie's or my Facebook pages. So we can keep this discussion going, and we will keep this webinar series going. We just haven't set a date for the next one. So we would welcome your emails on topics for the next one, and we'll go from there. Carrie, you've been very patient and very quiet. Why don't you jump in?
Sean, where did your article appear?
It was on Law Enforcement Today. They published it.
Wow. Okay, right after, when this webinar is over, I'm going to go find it. Are you familiar with Dr. Gil Martin's work, his book, Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement, or any of his training programs?
I am, sir. Yes, I read his book. I have a copy of it at my desk right now. So,
all right. So you know that he explains in his model. He describes there are about half a dozen steps that brings a person from the beginning in their early years when they have like kind of a rich personality. There are a lot of different dimensions to them, and then he talks about various processes. There's the biological one, the hypervigilance, biological roller coaster, and then there's various psychological causes as well. So the biology and the psychology combine to make it that all that remains for a person who once had a whole bunch of different rich dimensions to them. They were a very multifaceted kind of person. All that remains is the one dimension of the cop identity. And the way he puts it, I think this is the language he uses, that that leaves the person with nothing else left and all they are. And again, I don't mean to be disrespectful, because to be a cop, to be a first responder, there's nothing nobler than that in all the world. But I think, I hope you understand what I mean when I say just a cop. In other words, all the other dimensions of, in our private lives, in our personal relationships with other people, and, all the kinds of things that make us the rich people, the rich, multidimensional people that we are. When all of those are gone, and all that remains of the person is a cop. So he says that the cop, invests all of their emotional eggs in one basket of being a cop. They invest all their energies in that. And he says that's not a very healthy thing. To have the only outlet for what a person is, who a person is their cop role. He says that's too much pressure put on the role. Like that role was never intended to bear that kind of a burden. So he says when that's the case, and that's the one dimension that exists, so then he says that happens to be the only dimension over which a person doesn't have any control, because up the chain of command, they're the ones who have control. So here is somebody who all they have left is their cop dimension, and they have absolutely no control over that. And he says that creates victim-based thinking. So I think what I've seen in the trainings that I do, and people say, I can deal with all that garbage out there, it's what goes on in the department. I see that kind of victim-based thinking. In my own model, I mentioned before, I have my own model, and it's a little too complicated to explain why. It's more galling than anything else what goes on within the department. But if we had about 20 minutes, I could explain that as well. But I think Dr. Gilmartin's explanation, that process that he identifies, I think he does a great job in explaining why it is that there's a particular, all that energy is put into the anger at those people up the chain of command, because the law enforcement officer is really helpless. They're at the mercy of those people who are over them. And that's a tough situation in which to find oneself.
Why don't we pause here for a second and see if anybody else would like to chime in with some ideas to contribute to our discussion. Having heard none, let me just push ahead. Those of us that are collectively the Law Enforcement Survival Institute talk about something that we have labeled the re-evolution of law enforcement. And what that simply means, a revolution is something that causes drastic change. An evolution, put simply, is something that creates change that lasts over a huge span of time. And so we've compress those together to create a concept that we think law enforcement needs. And it by no means is saying that we're doing things wrong. We simply think we could probably do things better. And the better comes from the human side of the profession. Our belief is that if we don't take care of our people, we're not going to be able to take care of the people. And so the concept of a re-evolution is that we are so fascinated with flavors of the month. I don't remember how many of those came and went in my career. And to be honest, they were probably all great ideas. But we seem to try on great ideas like hats and we throw them away. And we don't ever let any of them take roots like they should. And so we created this concept of the re-evolution. That's a drastic change that's implemented over a long period of time. And what we challenge our readers, our listeners, our students to do is to join into this concept, because we believe that we have to make some change, and it has to stick. And we believe, obviously, there are so many facets to the profession. Technology is a huge component of the growth of our profession, but in my opinion, technology doesn't take care of the people. And so we're challenging everyone to join us in focusing on the people side of this business. How do we sustain people? How do we implement, Carrie's tools for intentional spirituality? How do we strengthen and condition people to have what it takes to get through this career and live happily ever after and be the compassionate professionals that the public wants us to be? All those things that seem so contrary to some of the pieces of our culture. So for all of you listening, live or in the future, we challenge you to join us. We challenge you to be part of this, and everybody's a leader. It only takes one person to start the discussion, to ask the questions, to pose the challenges, that hopefully others will pick up the reins and take this profession into the next century and make it a healthy one for the people that are working within it. Carrie?
Well, I would just want to, I just want to go back. We talked about, you know, what kind of advice would you give to a younger you or to those who follow? And as I mentioned before, I keep bringing it always back into the realm of the spiritual. I think that that's not just a dimension, I think it's the dimension. And I was at a program, as a retreat a few days ago. It was for people who had first responders. It wasn't just cops, although I think the overwhelming majority of the people in attendance were cops. But it was, you know, it was designed, it was meant in a broader sense for first responders. And they were there with their, you know, spouses, family members. And each person was talking. Everybody had a chance to describe, you know, what got them to, you know, to be at this, to be eligible, sadly, for this retreat. Because to be eligible meant that they had to have been diagnosed with PTSD. And to get the PTSD, they had to have been through things that were just, it was unspeakable. Unspeakable. And over the course of the weekend, the retreat, one of the things that struck me is that people get to that place. It's a very sad, lonely, hurting place. They get there in different ways. Different things happen to them. No single person there, their experiences, each one was overwhelming, but it was unique. But what struck me is that the kind of mechanisms, the tools, the methods that people can use to get out of that place of darkness and of pain and of hurting and of sadness, the tools, they don't have to be exotic. They don't have to be like, you know, oh my gosh, wow, they're, you know, this is shocking. It never would have occurred to me. They can be kind of common sense tools. John's book, for example, is filled with them. I think the last time I counted, there are something like 17,000 tools in there, right? I mean, how many, John? It just, you know, the book is about 1,500 pages long, and it's got thousands of exercises. And each of the tools, if you look at it, say, wow, that's really common sense. That is, you know, I can see, you know, I can understand why that would work. In my book, Spiritual Survival for Law Enforcement, I have a chapter with, I think there's 27 tools for intentional spirituality. None of them are, you know, none of the tools is exotic or unusual, shocking. They're, like I said, common sense. They make, you know, they're terrific. The power comes from their consistent, steady application. If a person does a few of these every single day over a long period of time, healing results. There's all kinds of great things, and people can get themselves out of that dark pit of despair by just slow and steady, every single day, the consistent application of these various kinds of tools. So as I mentioned before, as you know, John's book, he addresses the physical, the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual aspects of a person. The Law Enforcement Survival Institute, they have all kinds of practitioners, there are all kinds of faculty members. Each one of them has staked out their own position, and they're experts in, you know, whichever one of those dimensions they've decided to, you know, to study. So that's terrific. A person, anybody out there, and a number of people that said, I can't make it at the time to participate live, but I'm going to watch it later on. What I would tell you is that there are things that you can do to preside over your own healing. There are tools, there are plenty of them all over the place. If you contact John, if you contact me, we would be thrilled to set you up with these kinds of tools. But what I would add uniquely, my second point, is that tools are great. There's all kinds of stuff going on out there. Physical fitness is a great thing. I was just reading an article this morning about yoga for first responders. I think that's wonderful. There are all kinds of psychological tools. There's all kinds of things. What I would tell you is you've got to address the why dimension of yourself, the spiritual dimension. Because if you're taking care of your physical self, you're taking care of your mental self, your emotional self, if you're taking care of all of those aspects, but you're not addressing the spiritual aspect of yourself, which is the all-important one, so that no matter what kind of good work you're doing, it's going to be a little hollow. Because the things that really eat a person up in this career all come from the realm of the spiritual, the kind of spiritual disappointments, the disillusionment, the betrayal. All of that comes from the spiritual part of a person not being nourished. So it's a great thing. Collect as many of these tools for presiding over your own health and regaining balance and wholeness and all things. Do get as many tools as you can. Make sure though that some of those tools address the why, the spiritual aspect of who you are. If you do that, then there's a lot of healing down the line. You can reach a place of balance. You can step into the sunshine. I see this all the time. People can reach really, really dark places. And if they do what they can do, they can emerge into the sunshine and reach a place of wholeness and balance. That's what Bill was talking about before, having a sense of balance. You can get there. You can get there under your own power and the work that you do.
Let me chime into that for a second. I hope you can tell that Carrie and I have an awful lot of fun teaching together. But I also agree with him about the piece about the why. And we couldn't be any more opposite in that respect, in that I have never considered myself to be a religious person. I am not a chaplain. I had mixed upbringing as far as the church. But I think I went into law enforcement with an attitude I think a lot of my peers had, and that was, how can there be a God? How can the God let this happen? And if you've ever had anybody cry on your shoulder and ask you why did one of their loved ones die, or why did their child pass away, or why was it killed? It was hard for me to ever believe in God or religion. But I have to say that as I've gotten older, I've certainly become more spiritual. And a lot of what you read in my book and on copsalive.com is that piece about the why was the one piece that was the hardest to pin down, and the one piece that I think is so truly important. I nearly took my own life, and one of my friends did complete suicide. And so, I think that's the piece that's overlooked so much. And I think because it is attached to the stigma of a variety of religions, we have a hard time embracing it. And so one of the reasons that Carrie and I collaborate so often is because I think it is so important. And I think most people overlook that piece. Let me pause we're almost at the top of the hour again. Let me pause to see if anybody else had anything they wanted to share. Otherwise, I'll do a wrap up and send us off to the next one of these. All right, Carrie, did you have any final thoughts?
Well, I hope that this is the first webinar of many. And what I would suggest, I really enjoyed, I appreciated very much the people who who either posted directly on my Facebook or LinkedIn posts, or who private messaged me. It was very helpful. It's always important for me to get a sense of what is going on out there, how people are feeling, to get a sense of the pulse of what's going on out there. Sean, when you talked about, you're an active, officer right now, and you're giving us those perspectives, that's all important, because the training that we tried to design at the Law Enforcement Survival Institute, we want it to be responsive. We want it to be real world kinds of training that nourishes and strengthens and comforts the people who are doing this hardest and noblest of jobs. So every time somebody gets in touch with us and gives us information, it's really, really important, because you're not just allowing us to help you, you're helping us help an entire profession. There are about 870,000 sworn officers around the country. And the input that you give us will help us ultimately help, that entire community. So what I would suggest is, please, if you have thoughts, email us, submit ideas, a question for the next time, feedback, any kind of thoughts, any insights that you have. You can't do this job for any length of time without picking up some wisdom and figuring out, that's so weird. Why does the job work like this? Why does the culture work like this? It would be better if something else. Describe to us, please, what that would be, and we'll get busy trying to make that a reality. Thank you so much for joining us. And John, thank you for hosting this.
You're welcome. And we're excited about this technology because, this is new to us, but with this this particular platform. We have the ability to reach so many people around the world. I saw a couple of other countries represented and people that had signed up for this. So I'm excited that, you know, this isn't just an American policing issue, it's a worldwide policing issue. I've talked to people in many other countries, and cops are cops. We face the same problems and we face the same dilemmas, and it's about time that we start pulling people together and using that collective wisdom to make us all stronger. And so I thank you all for being here. I thank you for all that you do. Please stay safe and stay well. And please continue to communicate. We have a lot of platforms where you can reach us and you know, even have your own discussions. So please reach out. And as I said earlier, take the seeds we planted today, take them forth and see what you can cultivate where you are. And let us know what you'd like to hear for next time. I will leave you with one little teaser. In my book, I talked about a concept called blue trauma syndrome. And that was a completely made up term to try to address this issue that we sort of talked about today. What is it that is getting to us? And the simple answer for everyone is stress. But when you really learn about stress, it's a necessary part of our job. So we're probably talking about negative stresses. But I want us all to be discussing this concept of blue trauma. What is it, and then how do we get rid of it? So until next time, please stay safe, stay well. I'm John Marks. That was Kerry Friedman. We'll see you next time. Take care.
Be safe.